Hello and welcome everyone to another episode of The Power of Stories, the Doctors Schuster and Oxley podcast. Today we're joined by John Gibbs, someone we had the pleasure of spending some time with recently when we appeared on his podcast, which was broadcast on the New Books Network. Also, it's somewhat nerve-wracking when you go on someone else's podcast because, I can't help but to have some inferiority complex. You look at how other people do it and they do it so well that when you bring it back to here, you think, we really need to up our game a little bit. When we asked John whether he was going to appear on this podcast, we ask our guests to come up with a story or suggest a story. And so John's story, I won't steal his thunder, but is born from a combination of poetry and insight. And it got me thinking about two things. It got me thinking about poetry, and it also got me thinking a little bit about John himself, who is a great illustration of what we talk about in our last book about reinvention, about someone who continues to strive after a successful university lecturer career. He's building something new. And I think it's intriguing to talk to people who are continuing to discover new things about themselves and the world, long into an era when our parents, and certainly our grandparents, possibly would have been pottering around the garden and drinking copious amounts of tea. So I was thinking about poetry specifically, and I thought, is there some good illustrations of how poetry talks about reinvention? And I'm always drawn to the Robert Frost poem. The two roads diverged in a wood and I took the one less traveled. And I think it's interpreted a number of different ways, but I've always seen it as choosing a path. This is the key, making a conscious choice between, in this instance, two alternatives. But so often in our careers and professional life, we tend to sort of just drift along. We tend to sort of take one day and just, not unlike our Groundhog Career book, where you're just essentially on autopilot. So I quite like that. Now, I've often quoted the Robert Frost. I think many of us are perhaps guilty of using it as a punctuation. But then, of course, there's Alfred Lord Tennyson, who talked about to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. I don't quote that very often, but I do like that again. So it's not the language of someone trying to quietly wind things down. To strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. I really feel, in a way, for those of us throughout our careers, probably applies. But when you get into your 60s, as at least two of the three of us are, it becomes words to think carefully about, not to yield, keep going. And then, of course, Dylan Thomas. How could I not complete the little intro without a reference to Dylan Thomas, a somewhat more aggressive approach towards the idea of going, do not go gentle into the good night, rage against the dying of the light. Now, if that's not words to live a professional life by, I don't know what else is. I mean, you could take that perhaps a bit too far. And I've certainly worked with people who have raged a lot, perhaps without always good substance. So it feels like career advice in Dylan Thomas's case perhaps needs to be somewhat more selective, but I like all three of those quotes, and I felt that as a way to intro this particular podcast, that they weren't bad icebreakers. Helmut, do you have any reflections on those quotes or a favored quote of your own?
Well, basically, I fully agree, and thanks for actually researching the topic so thoroughly. You're always very well prepared, and I really appreciate that a lot. But I mean, I think I want to bring in. I'm not as poetic as you were, David, I think, but there's one book that really impressed me. It was a book by Herminia Ibarra, and I guess you might have read her book or many books. She was a Cuban who came to New York and as a child, and now is, I think, teaches at London Business School. But she wrote a book, I think, probably 10 years ago, which is basically called Working Identity. And she said one thing which really, really resonated with me then and still does resonate. She said reinventing involves trying on and testing different and a variety of possible selves. And I think this is a very deep statement when you think about that. And I just really think that's so true. And that basically, David, for you and me, basically that's exactly what we did. Yeah, we're trying, we're writing. So I think that's great. And on a more poetic side, I think, and we all have read his book, The Great Gatsby. And there's one quote I really, really enjoy. He says, "So we beat on boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past." And that's what I see in day-to-day life. People are so scared to reinvent. They are so wedded to the current jobs, to the current careers, to the current companies that they just don't move on. So this has been my my thoughts on the topic of reinvention.
Lovely. Well, let me do a quick intro to John and we'll turn it over. So, as I mentioned, John Gibbs joins us today. Familiar voice for those who are a avid listener of the New Books Network. John had a successful career as an academic, a lecturer and researcher in film and cultural criticism. I don't know if this is true. You know, when you put these things into the computer and ask, tell me about John Gibbs, sometimes they come up with different John Gibbs, but it says that you're an editor of The Movie, a journal of film criticism, and a co-editor of a series of close readings in film and television. Is that true, John?
No. That's another John Gibbs, I think. I was
Well,
certainly
you know,
a lecturer.
I thought,
I have
that's
that,
very
actually. Come to think of
impressive.
it.
Good try.
If I'm going to invent myself, why not? The career in teaching cultural studies, absolutely, yes. A long career in that. And academic, yes, that's true. Not the other bit, though. Nothing published in that sense. So
as we discussed, John's also reinventing himself in a we would say corporate life, in his case, academic life, and very impressively has a series of podcasts that we were fortunate to appear upon. Let me turn it over to Helmut, who's going to put you through the 20 questions. Not so much 20 questions, but over to you, Helmut.
That was David's message to me. Keep it brief. So I will keep it brief. John, basically, this is really about like for the audience to get to know you a bit better. And I'm not going to ask you 20 questions, but I think I always ask questions. I would be very much interested in knowing more about you. So what is your, if you basically went to an island and you could take one book along, yeah, which book would it be? So what is your book of the day, of the month, of the year, I guess?
Well, today I'll be referring to a poetry by Philip Larkin, so I'll take any of his works along, of course. But if it was a book other than a collection of poetry, it might be Middlemarch, something like that.
Okay, brilliant. Interesting. Good, very good. The other thing is really just like, if there's one person that inspired you in your life, I know there are normally more people than one, but if there's one person you would like to point out or draw out, who would that be?
That's an oddly easy and yet surprisingly difficult question. I'm not sure whether to refer to, people from history or literature or anything. And of course, as any people, as most human beings, I'll simply say my father, because that is always going to be true, isn't it, really?
I would very much agree with that. It normally is a parent or like a teacher. So I do agree with that very, very much so. Now, last question, that's going to be probably the most difficult. Like, you're currently in the process of reinventing yourself, and I really enjoyed being on your podcast last time. You really inspired me a lot. The conversation was very deep. So 10 years from now, if you could dream when you wake up on a Monday morning and you say 10 years from now, I would like to ... What would you like to have achieved, be?
I'll take waking up and being alive and healthy. That would be good. Absolutely. I think that if waking up in 10 years from now still involves a sense of the delightful privilege of being alive, which I feel constantly, then that would be good. That, as long as that continues. Other than that, I think that it is a warm summer's day and there is a garden available. That'll do.
Wow.
I mean, have you considered 10 years from now possibly editing a movie called A Journal of Film Criticism, because that's something clearly missing from your resume?
Yeah, well, I think someone out there has beaten me to it and they've stolen my name. So, what can I do?
Anything else, Helmut?
No, I think that was a great answer. I know that if asked the same question to David, it would be far more aspirational, probably, and far more ambitious and selling like 1 million books or something like that. But I really like John, like David is competitive. Yeah, it's unrealistic, but still, I think one needs to be very aspirational. But I really like to answer John, because this is actually so important, just the joy in life. That's what I heard out of your basically answer, the joy in life. I want to be 10 years from now. I really want to enjoy the small things in life. And I really like that message to all of us. So, David, back to you.
John, we ask our guests to share a story that has meaning for them, and then we discuss it. You had suggested the reading by Philip Larkin. So over to you, share your story, and then let's have a conversation about why you think it's so significant.
Super, thank you. I thought thank you for inviting me to tell a story, and also assuring me that that was in its broadest sense. So that allowed me to do a couple of things, really. It is a sort of composite story. It has a story element to it. The first bit I didn't mention, I would say, would be a memory. So I'll start with a memory, then a poem, then an anecdote, and I think they're linked. So I'll start with the memory. The memory is a very simple one. Since we have mentioned my father, about 20 odd years ago or so, not more, yes, more than 20 now, he died. He was an elderly man and led a good life and so forth. And it was my incumbent upon me there to think about how we would celebrate his life and what kind of funeral we might involve ourselves in organising. And he was all his life an atheist, expressed no religious belief of any kind or spirituality of any kind at all, mostly seeing it as superstition and so forth. So how to do this? And I thought that, many of the options for funerals were somewhat municipal and somehow didn't capture it. But I knew him, of course. He liked old buildings. He liked history. He liked architecture. He liked all those things. And we never, as a child, never passed a church without wanting to go in and look around and comment on it. We never passed a scenic view without looking at it. We never passed an old castle or cathedral without having to go in, and not having to go in, but delightfully going in and looking around. So that led me to, when I came across the poetry of Philip Larkin, to his poem, Church Going, which I had learned in that era of your life when you learn poetry when young. So church going seemed to me to express something of this apparent contradiction between someone who loved churches but abhorred all things religious. So yeah, this is church. So now we're on to the poem. That was the memory. The poem is as follows. It's Church Going by Philip Larkin. Once I'm sure there's nothing going on, I step inside, letting the door thud shut. Another church, matting, seats and stone, little books, sprawlings of flowers, cut for Sunday, brownish now. And that tense, unignorable silence brewed God knows how long. Brass and stuff, up at the holy end, a small, neat organ. Hatless now, I remove my cycle clips in awkward reverence. Moving forward, run my hand around the font. From where I stand, the roof looks almost new, repainted or restored. Someone would know. I don't. Mounting the lectern, I peruse a few large-scale hectoring verses and pronounce, "Here endeth," louder than I'd meant. The echoes snicker. Back at the door, I sign the visitor's book, donate an Irish sixpence, and reflect the place was not worth stopping for. Yet stop I did, and often do, and end at a loss like this, wondering what to look for. Wondering, too, when churches fall completely out of use, what we shall turn them into. Keep a few cathedrals chronically on show, their parchment, plate and pyx in locked cases, let the rest out rent-free, to rain and sheep. Or shall we consider them unlucky places? After dark will dubious women come to make their children touch a particular stone, collect simples for a cancer, or, on some advised night, see walking a dead one. Power of some sort or other will continue, in riddles and games seemingly at random. But superstition, like belief, must die. And what remains when disbelief is gone? Grass, weedy pavement, brambles, buttress, sky. Who will be the last, the very last, to seek this place for what it was? One of the crew that tap and jot and know what Rudolphs were? Some ruin bibber, randy for antique, or Christmas addict, counting on a whiff of gown and bands and organ pipe and myrrh? Or will they be my representative, knowing the ghostly silt dispersed, bored, uninformed, knowing the ghostly silt dispersed, yet tending to this cross of ground through suburb scrub, because it held for so long and so equably that which is found in separation, marriage, birth and death, and thoughts of these, for which this special shell was built. For though I've no idea what this accoutred frowsty barn is worth, it pleases me to stand in silence here. A serious house on serious earth it is, in whose blent air all our compulsions meet, are recognised and robed as destinies. And that much at least can never be obsolete, since someone will be surprising in themselves, forever surprising in themselves, a hunger to be more serious, and gravitating with it to this ground, which they'd once heard was proper to grow wise in. If only that so many dead lie round. That's the poem. And
Impressive.
the anecdote is a story. And the anecdote is apparently the physicist Niels Bohr had a visit to his house, and they noticed a horseshoe above his door. And they said, "Well, Niels, you're a great physicist. You can't possibly believe in the superstition of that horseshoe." He says, No, of course I don't believe it," he said. "But I've heard it works, even if you don't believe it." Now, I think
Yeah, I
those
love that.
three observations,
Yes. Yep.
it's a circular kind of paradox. Well, of course, but it strikes me that says something that resonates again with me very much. The sense of how do you celebrate? What meaning do you find in symbol? How do you find meaning in ritual in our particular age? And that I think particularly the line hunger to be more serious. I think we have a particular problem in our culture, in our time that we live in, of finding opportunities to and being unafraid to be serious.
Well, let me
And
first
that,
of all do this. Well, it's not working. Oh, no, my sound effects are not working. Well, I have to do it this way then. Well done.
I fully agree with that.
I don't think we've had such an amazing reading as that, John. So congratulations. You show your skills as a lecturer and a presenter. It was beautifully presented. And I haven't read some Larkin work, actually, probably since I was at school. So that was a lovely reminder. And I like the horseshoe analogy as well. Helmut, what are your immediate reactions on the poem and the anecdote?
Well, basically, firstly, thank you, John. It was a real gift, and I'm speechless. In particular, just came back from, especially the church poem really, really resonated with me. I just came back from Barcelona. And ever since I was 16, every time I go to Barcelona, I go to La Sagrada Familia. And that has been building probably for more than 100 years and has never been finished. And now they pointed out that the largest spire has just been finished. And it made me so much think about the symbolism of churches and the symbolism of Sagrada Familia, something is never going to be finished. And people say, well, actually, La Sagrada Familia, the essence of it is that it's never going to be finished. Like belief is never going to be finished or complete. Like purpose is never going to be finished. It's the process that really counts. And so your poem really very much resonated with me. It reminded me of that. And the other thing, and that is really a question to you, the anecdote, I find that very powerful because for me it symbolizes like the power of manifestation, of self-fulfilling prophecy. Yeah, if you believe in things, it's gonna work. Yeah, we've had in medicine the placebo effect, which people could never really figure out why it works. Yeah, and so I found both the poem and the anecdote actually quite thought-provoking for me personally. David, any thoughts from you?
I think so first of all, poetry is one of these things that I have a very awkward relationship with because I read the poems that they put on the London Tube and I don't find them particularly good. They're to me awkward, too complicated, or I think they're supposed to evoke a certain imagery that I'm just not sophisticated enough to understand, I think. So, but then I listen to Larkin and the way that you read it and I go, oh no, I entirely see that as a beautiful set of images that immediately resonate with me. I can picture exactly, the idea of cycling past a village church that might be in disrepair and going in and exploring and then all the memories of what might have gone on in the church appearing. And so that resonated. And then it re-engages the notion that poetry can be quite beautiful. It can provide, some stimulation for the brain in areas that perhaps you don't typically get. But you've got to pause and be open to it. I suppose that's the key in our busy lives. Again, I said at the outset, I think the last time I read Larkin was when I was forced to read it at school, as opposed to engage with it in a more personal choice sort of way. So I think that's the first reflection that I have. So I think that's lovely to have that reminder. The second, I think, is that there are two or three things within the poem that are lovely to pick up on because I think they have resonance. John, you talked about this idea of, in a way, sort of superficiality, in a way, the idea of substance and symbols. I think it is a world where there's a lot of symbolism, but it's a somewhat superficial symbolism, isn't it? It's Instagram over old church buildings. Ironically, it's beautifully photoshopped pictures of churches on Instagram as opposed to physically entering one. What does that say about, are we missing out on something? What are the questions that follow, John, from that observation?
I think you're absolutely right. I think that, first of all, Helmut, I'll comment on poetry on the underground. I do rather like poetry on the underground in a sense, because I think it's trying to break us out of our feeling that it is, there are obstacles, in other words, to being serious, and poetry often deals with serious things. It's an attempt to express something about the human condition, and we're rather afraid to do that. Being serious, I think, now the obstacles, I think you've identified one there, David, very much. The obstacle to seriousness is the endless reproduction of our culture that we see so much in such a superficial sense that never before in human history have we had so much information, so much reproduction of cultural imagery that it can become almost meaningless. It's like saying that, that thing you do as a kid, you say the same word over and over and over and over and over again. And you suddenly think, oh, the word means nothing. It's actually started to enter my brain as a meaningless sound. So you can take the meaning out of things by reproduction. I think it's one part of the problem. Although also I think there is a sort of utilitarian philistinism about our culture as well, in that if a thing cannot be measured, it probably isn't serious. If a thing can't be quantized, it probably isn't serious. And so that the poem for me expresses, as does the anecdote, the impossibility of the contradiction. I want to be serious. I want to find some ritual that has meaning, but I sort of know it doesn't. I want to go into the church and find and feel something, and I can do that, but I sort of know it's just maybe because there are dead people buried outside. So as I look out the window here, I can see a church across the way. I'm fortunate I lived next to a church, which I never go in. My wife goes there for the religious aspect of the church, but I mostly see the church.
It's convenient, though, presumably. At some point, it'll be very convenient for you.
Yes, true. Yes, I certainly, for the purposes. Yes, if ever I require a funeral, it's right next door.
Yes.
But
what do you think?
Being able to embrace the simple. Being able to embrace the simple. My not facetious observation that 10 years from now, being alive and finding joy in a garden would be indeed an aspiration, because in that place you might find some sort of serious reflection. Not because it's simply of being awake, as it were.
Can I pick up on this point though, John? Because there is aimless, mindless wandering. There is aimless, mindless strolling. There is a sort of glazing over, dumbing of the senses. And then there is the wandering with exploration and wanderlust of what could have gone on here. What is the backstory, the inquiry? That state of mind makes a extraordinary difference, doesn't it? And in Larkin's poem, the author talks about all of the memories that are triggered, or all of the possibilities that could have occurred in this building, this symbol, and of their own mortality and of the mortality of others. But in a way that is a state of mind, that is a state of inquiry and questioning, critical thinking, call it what you will. What would be your observation?
Yeah. Well, Larkin paid a price in a way for being so serious, because he was deeply concerned in many of his poems about death and its approach, in things like his poem Obeyed, another poem he wrote about hospital thinking about how he went end his life in one day in a hospital and so on. He did pay a rather unhealthy price, I think, which hopefully most of us should avoid, by reflecting on the mortality. And of course, that's not, as you said, unfashionable. That's not something we modern humans like to do very much. We've tidied away death, we've tidied away mortality quite nicely, and made it much more about a process of putting it behind us and moving on and dealing with the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stages of grief, or whatever it is that we imagine them to be. So we are unable, I think, to confront in quite the way he did the seriousness of being alive and being human. Partly because I think it didn't do Larkin any particular good. I don't think he was a particularly happy human being, and certainly drank an awful lot in order to deal with those problems, to deal with that reflective capacity. So yeah, I think in a sense we are probably right in a way, and to avoid being unhealthily concerned with our own mortality. But on the other hand, I think uniquely superficial in our particular time. So yeah. And I think the quantity of material around us and our tendency to be cynical about serious things. And also, I'll point at schools as well. You mentioned you came across Larkin in schools. Forcing children to have poetry, which then they are examined on whether they successfully can understand it or not, isn't the approach. I prefer the one encountering it unexpectedly on the tube, to be honest.
Mm-hmm. John, I'm really interested. I had the impression that you, and maybe that's wrong, that you questioned the reflective capacity of the new generation, the next generation. And I'm not sure if I see that. I think they're all searching for purpose. They just find it much harder to find purpose. I mean, in my parents' generation, it was very easy. Purpose was rebuilt after World War II. They realized they had to rebuild from rubble. They got married and wanted to have many children, and purpose was very clear. Young people now live in an abundance, at least in the Western world, but I see many signs that there is plenty of reflective capacity, desire, but I do believe our generation, their parents, have not really taught them how to live a life. So we spoiled them rotten and created in some instances probably very unhappy children. But I really believe I'm very optimistic about the current generation, and I do believe they've all the skills, they've everything it takes to make the next 20, 30 years, again, very good years. But I do not see this superficiality to the extent you seem to see it.
Yes.
It's just
I think you're right.
I just wanted to get your ideas to that.
No, you're absolutely right to pick me up on that. And indeed, it's so easy for me and anyone of a certain age to drift into feeling that young people today aren't as reflective and thoughtful and so on. And and when one could list a series of material things, consumption or whatever, the superficial, or scrolling endlessly on their phones or whatever. Yeah, that's unfair. That direction of thought would be very unfair of me to say that. And I think that their ability to be concerned with the world would have is as you say is surprising. It's my own children or the students I taught. Often they have a deep and profound concern with the sorts of things that human beings do, and hold us all to a high moral account, which is the right of the young to do, and I'm sure they do that. So yeah, so I shouldn't really head in that direction. So when I talk about the superficiality of our culture, it's a feature I think we have to concern ourselves with. But I wouldn't say it was something that was I would blame the young for.
Okay,
but
cool.
It's not their problem.
Because I'm in the same place. Okay,
because that would be unfair.
Pick up on,
and also I'd be.
Yeah. So, John, I was just going to pick up on your horseshoe anecdote a little bit at the end, because I did see a more direct parallel to professional life. We try and make this podcast relevant for an audience thinking about professional life, careers. Sometimes the stories don't have to be over-explained. They can have meaning based on whatever interpretation people get, which I think is great. The horseshoe thing was interesting, though, because in a way I see this parallel to, do I believe in something or don't I? Is there any harm in the superstition of something? And I saw two parallels. The first is that there was a point that I convinced myself I had lucky socks for presentations, that I had to wear a pair of socks. And whenever I did a board presentation, one specific pair of socks would make sure that whatever presentation I did was well received. And there was, I think of myself as a rational, logical man, and yet that was something that for some time I was quite convinced by, until it didn't work. And then I realized that it was just wishful thinking. But the second thing I think is this hedging. I don't know I believe in the company's mission. I don't know I believe in what the leadership are talking about. That is the proverbial horseshoe. But what's the harm in going along with it? You know, if they believe it, then I'll just blow with the wind because it's the popular thing to do. There's no harm to me personally. What's your reflection on that?
I think, we do live, all of us are going to live surrounded by symbol. And these things are going to be meaningful to us in our homes, in our houses, in our jobs, in our lives, in our national identity. We're going to construct our identity through the experience of symbolic meaning, whether it's an object, and you're quite irrational things. I'm going to grieve over breaking a teapot that my mother left me or something like that. I'm going to keep a thing from childhood, a toy, and not want to throw it away. I'm going to look at photographs of I'm going to construct, in other words, a network of objects and symbols around me to give me meaning in my life. And I don't think we need to be afraid of that. My house is the museum of me, and my job and my occupation and how I value myself will often be through objects that represent things to me in this particular time, in this particular place. And I think it's quite normal and natural and so on. In other words, if you simply apply a kind of utter rationalism, do you need this thing? Reason not the need. Do you need this thing? Why do you want these things? Then you end up with everything having no meaning. So no matter how you divorce yourself from, no matter how rational you want to be, have to accept that all sorts of irrational things will give you meaning and purpose.
I think that, I fully agree with you on that. I mean, you need to find things that give you meaning in life. I really believe that's the essence of being a human. You want to find purpose. For me, the question is always, does this link to the past limit you from reinventing yourself to become a different version of yourself? And this is for me one of the key philosophical questions. And I find it was very funny when people on LinkedIn have basically defined their job as either retired or ex whatever they were, yeah. And I always question, yeah, do you really want to be defined by your past, or is it possible when you're in your 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, whatever, redefine your persona, yourself, and explore a different version of yourself? And this is for me one of the key questions in life, I think, which I have not answered for myself, but it's an inquiry which I think is very important.
What's the difference between saying former BP executive versus soon-to-be best-selling author?
Basically, I would just say author. Successful
No,
author,
but the point
Mr.
being,
Oxley.
one's retrospective, the other's prospective. What's the, how is there nonsense in both?
My point is, if you're on a boat and the anchor is basically in the ground, the boat is not going to move. If you get the anchor out, it gives you the mobility to move forward. And as long as your past anchors you in the past, question is, can you really explore a new identity and version of yourself? That is my question, really. My inquiry.
Yes, we are going to lock ourselves in. We are going to view ourselves from our past, the things of the past, the objects of the past, our past as we imagine it to be, whether it's real or not. Is surely to divorce yourself from that. The reinvention sounds good, and reinvention is clearly what we do all the time. Because I'm not the same as I was when I was a child. I'm not the same as I was when I was middle-aged or younger or whatever. I'm clearly reinventing myself as I change through life. But all the time, I'm dragging with me the objects of the past, surely, because that gives me my sense of who I am. And without that, I mean, that must be a very scary place to be if you lose a sense of who you are. Which I think is why we surround ourselves with things of meaning, and it would be such a disaster for us if most of us lost those things. And those things are people and objects and places which root us in some kind of sense of stability.
You have to have an anchor. Yeah, I agree. A tether. We're reaching that point of the podcast, my friends, that Helmut then poses a very difficult question for you, John, and then we move on to the end of the podcast. So, Helmut, would you like to pose John the million-dollar question?
Well, it's not a really difficult question, and I'm very interested in your answer to that because you have so much experience in academia. So if you had to give the next generation like one advice, just one, yeah, what would it be? What is the one thing you would tell them?
Well, I would say...
Beyond reading the books by Dr. Schuster and Oxley, of course.
Well, obviously, that is taken as read, as it were, or not read, but to be read. Yes. No. Yeah. Notwithstanding that excellent piece of advice, I would say enjoy the delights of gardening, and this will immediately alienate me from most young people, or possibly not. And I'm reaching back here to the classical Greeks and the Stoics and so on, who very much enjoyed the idea of accepting the moment and living in the moment. And gardens can do that for you. So whether you are, there will be a moment in your life when you'll appreciate being in a garden, and it's never too soon to do it.
That's brilliant.
I think again, my sound effects are not working for some reason, so I'll do that again.
And I would agree with you. Gardening is magic.
John, as we wrap up this podcast, I'll do a little close in a second, but any final reflections you'd like to share on Larkin, the horseshoes, or our discussion?
Only that you've given me, thank you very much, the opportunity to link together three quite disparate ideas and think about them. And I think that podcasting as I do podcasting as you do, is an opportunity for us to be more serious. And I don't mind if my audience is 10 people or 1,000,000 people. It doesn't matter in one way or another. It's simply an opportunity, and thank you for providing this one, to be more serious.
Helmut, any final thoughts before I close?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to repeat what I did at your podcast, John. It's so inspirational to share ideas and have a conversation with such a thoughtful and educated person as you are. I really immensely enjoyed today, as I did last time. So thank you very much for being on this podcast.
It should be understood that it's because Helmut has to deal with me most of the time that he particularly appreciates those qualities. That's what I'd say, since everyone was
That's
thinking
not what I'm saying, David, and you know
I think we know what you
how
were saying.
much I respect you.
David, I picked that up. I did, I wasn't going to say that. That's, I saw that inference. That was, really. Helmut, that was harsh.
John, thank you so much for appearing on this podcast. This was another Doctors Schuster and Oxley production podcast, The Power of Stories. Delighted to have John. If you'd like to hear more about John Gibbs' work on the New Book Network, I will provide a link in this episode. John is showcasing a number of new books that he researches or trips across that are lesser known but worthy of discussion. Fortunately, the career advice books, the Shea Sinope trilogy, was one of those that he showcased. So we're very grateful to him for that. Thanks again for John and his thoughts for appearing today. This episode of Dr. Schuster and Oxley's podcast is our 24th. If you'd like to watch or listen to the other 23, you can find them on our library or the big platforms, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and so forth. We also have 3 books that you may not have heard enough about, which are now in a special collector's edition. Look at this. How beautiful is that? With pictures of Schuster and Oxley on the back. I've tried to make it small so it's not too intrusive into your life. So check out the books. If you like the books, if you like the podcast, then you will like our Instagram and our website and our LinkedIn content, which we keep fresh every week. So I don't know that there's much more for me to add. Thank you for joining us for this podcast. We look forward to seeing you again soon, and the best of wishes to John. Any final words, gentlemen?
Thank you very much.
Okay.
I'll plug my other podcast.
Go ahead.
Can I plug my other podcast?
Please do.
It's called the Spinoza Triad. It's 3 people who talk about philosophy, and that's out there somewhere.
Okay.
The Spinoza
I might
Triad.
check that out. Okay. Thank you, John. Thank you, Helmut.